Hey there! In this month's edition of New Scientist dated June 12, 2021, there was an article that looked at the why people should avoid eating junk food. It explores the fact that it contains too much fat, salt, and sugar, while the categorization of food should be relooked at. It categorized it into four, ranging from unprocessed whole foods to ultra-processed food. If you are looking for more information on processed food, continue listening on as we go through the article. Dangerously delicious. Cut down on fatty food. No sugar. Aim for a Mediterranean diet. And remember to eat more plants. The variability of healthy eating advice has become a cliché in itself. Yet despite all the contradictions, there is one thing that many agree on: we should avoid junk food. Until recently though, no one could give you a decent reason why. Gastronomic snobbery aside, science lacked an agreed definition of what junk food actually is, and that has made it difficult to know whether we should be avoiding it and, if so, why. It has long been assumed that processed junk foods are bad because they tend to contain too much fat, salt, and sugar. Recent studies, though, suggest that other mechanisms could be at work to make these foods harmful to our health. Getting to grips with what these are could help us not only make healthier choices, but also persuade processed food has a bad reputation. But is it uniquely bad for our health? Claire Wilson investigates the food industry to come up with healthier ways of giving us what we like to eat. One thing's for sure, we certainly do like it. Factory-made food makes up between 50 and 60% of the average person's calorie intake in the UK, and around 60% in the US. But while junk food has a bad name among many food lovers, dietary health research and the public health advice that stems from it have so far concentrated either on individual food groups, like meat and dairy products, or the relative amounts of the three macronutrients: proteins, fats, and carbohydrates that we consume. In most countries, nutrition guidelines advise people to base their diet on starchy carbohydrates like bread and pasta, while eating plenty of fruit and vegetables, limiting meat and dairy to avoid too much fat, and swerving salt and sugar where possible. Although factory-made foods tend to be high in the frowned-on ingredients of fat, salt and sugar, few national guidelines explicitly advise people to avoid processed foods and instead cook meals from scratch. That is where the field of nutrition has been going wrong, according to Tim Spector, an epidemiologist at King's College London who studies food's effects on health. What policymakers should focus on, he says, is getting people to change to eating real food. The development of a new way to classify foods by the degree of processing is a first step toward that goal. Called NOVA, the system was designed by Carlos Monteiro, a nutrition researcher at the University of São Paulo in Brazil, and his colleagues. The latest iteration identifies four groups, ranging from unprocessed whole foods to ultra-processed foods. The ultra-processed group includes not just things usually seen as junk food, like fries or frozen pizzas, but also some breakfast cereals, soups, ostensibly healthy low-fat, low-salt ready meals, and even most kinds of mass-produced bread. The defining criteria is that they are made using processes not normally used at home, such as high-pressure fat hydrogenation and production of hydrolyzed vegetable proteins using hydrochloric acid. They also contain artificial additives, such as coloring, sweeteners, and flavor enhancers, designed to make the food more palatable. The NOVA classification system was important because it gave researchers the common language needed to study the links between ill health and factory-made food, says Marion Nessel at New York University, a former U.S. government advisor who writes about the food industry. The concept of ultra-processing is powerful, she says, because it gets us beyond talking about individual nutrients and talking about food as a whole. The first large studies looking at links between consumption of ultra-processed food and health started coming through in the past 2 decades. A clear association began to emerge between these foods and ill health, with people who ate the most being at a higher risk of obesity and conditions such as heart disease and diabetes. One study even found that the more ultra-processed food in a person's diet, the higher their risk of early death. More than 4 portions of ultra-processed food a day increased the risk of death during the 15 years of the study by 62%, or with each additional portion raising risk by 18%. An analysis of all 23 studies done so far on the relationship between ultra-processed foods and health, published in 2020, also concluded that there were links between junk food intake and worse rates of high blood pressure, and unhealthy cholesterol levels. Fast food focus. Importantly, while nutrition research is notorious for its contradictory results, one day a study finds that too much fat is the main problem with our diets, while the next, a paper blames carbohydrates. This doesn't seem to be the case for ultra-processed foods, says Monteiro. With red meat, some studies say, yes, there is an association with ill health, some, no. In the case of ultra-processed food, all show an association. So far, so bad. But these kinds of studies can only find correlations between eating junk food and bad health. They can't prove that one causes the other. We know that eating more junk food also correlates with having a low income, which brings many health disadvantages. The only way to tease apart cause and effect would be to carry out a randomized trial where the only difference between two groups of people is their diet. For a long time, no such trial existed. Then in 2019, Kevin Hall, a physiologist at the U.S. National Institutes of Health, and his colleagues enrolled 20 participants into just such a study. He asked volunteers to stay on site for the 4-week duration of the experiment so that every morsel passing their lips could be analyzed. For 2 weeks, they ate snacks and meals that were mainly ultra-processed food, a careful selection of chicken nuggets, ready meal ravioli, cookies, cereal, and the like. For another 2 weeks, they ate nothing but whole foods including fruits, vegetables, meat, and yogurt. The participants were offered about twice as much food as they should have needed, and they could eat as much or as little of it as they wished. Crucially, the two diets were controlled so that the snacks and meals on offer contained more or less the same amounts of fat, protein, total carbohydrates, sugar, salt and fiber. The effect on the volunteers was dramatic. On the ultra-processed diet, people put on weight, gaining an average of 0.9 kilograms. On the whole foods diet, people lost the same amount on average, just under a kilo. As it turned out, when given free rein to eat as much processed food as they liked, people ate about 500 calories more over the course of a day than if they were choosing from whole foods. That's a large difference, says Hall. There's clearly a causal relationship. One possible explanation is that people ate more of the processed food because they found it tastier. On questionnaires, the volunteers rated it as only slightly nicer than the whole food meals, a difference so small it could have arisen by chance. But how much we eat of any particular food isn't solely down to our conscious opinion of its tastiness. Ultra-processed foods generally come loaded with just the right amount of fat, salt and sugar for us to find them hard to resist. Think of how communities to eat more than you intended from packet of biscuits or crisps, says Nessel. You can't just eat one. Ultra-processed food could also have led to overeating in another way, by encouraging people to eat faster. Most of this type of food has water taken out of it during manufacturing. Think of crisps compared with boiled potatoes. You end up with a more concentrated form of the food, says Hall. With each bite, you are eating more calories. To shed further light on this, Hall's team is planning a further trial, this time with a third arm that provides ultra-processed meals.